Good evening. In the 75 or 80 years or so I've been doing this, we have never had a return visit from guests the following year. On the other hand, we've never had a political climate and a president quite like this one. So it seemed like a good idea to break precedent. Last year, our two guests were a team at the New York Times, just as they had been at Politico in 2012. Now they are pursuing different paths at the New York Times. Maggie Haberman, a veteran of New York Post and the New York Daily News and Politico, is a White House correspondent, and it's fair to say, I think, has established a link to President Trump that sometimes seems like a real-life version of the president's analyst, or Brokeback Mountain, where the president's "I can't quit her." When he's not attacking her or her paper, he's giving her access to his thinking in ways that I can't ever remember a reporter establishing with a president, which is one reason why she is the most frequently sought out reporter at the Times when people go online. Alex Burns, who went straight from Harvard to Politico to the New York Times, is now a national political correspondent who spent much of the last 100 days looking into the impact of the president, both politically and substantively, in states around the country. So as this massively overhyped 100 days benchmark approaches, with the inevitable hair pulling out and rending of garments about what it means, and knowing that for the political community this is going to be the obsession over the next week and change, it seemed like the right idea to bring these two folks back to a Y audience. Look, I am fully aware that many of you still wake up most days thinking, is this really happening? Well, it is. And I can't think of two better voices to tell us what it means than, ladies and gentlemen, Maggie Haberman and Alex Burns. I mentioned last time I was here, folks, that these lights are going to, turn you, and you're going to confess to the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, but you'll get used to it.
Pretty soon, actually.
Yeah. So, this 100 days stuff, from the White House point of view, how obsessed are they with trying to make the case, Maggie, that this has been an amazing, fantastic, bigly, unprecedented, wonderful 100 days? Have they drunk the Kool-Aid on this?
I mean, the problem is that you just used all of the basic terms they have to do that, and that's about all they have in terms of facts, right? Because there's not a whole lot about this 100 days beyond the appointment of a Supreme Court justice, which in this climate, to be sure, is not nothing, although they did have to change Senate rules to get it done. But this is a president who is preoccupied with metrics and measurements and ratings, as we know, and this is sort of an easy frame for him to understand. He knows the media is obsessed with it, so he is obsessed with it. And his aides, a lot of them, not all of them certainly, and certainly not most of the senior ones, but enough of them do come from Washington to understand that this does have, sort of a historical significance for the media in D.C. And they have been focusing on it for the last 6 weeks or so pretty aggressively. This is going to consume most of this week. That said, again, beyond saying it's the best, it's bigly, it's wonderful, it's tremendous, I don't think that they are realistically going to be able to point to that much that is not going to have the press calling foul at a lot of points. And this is a president, Michael Kruse in Politico did a very good story about this today, just that this is a president who is, and I've said this before, but he is always selling. I mean, when I speak to him, it's because he's trying to sell me. When he speaks to Bob Costa at the Washington Post, he's trying to sell him. And so he will take this chair and say to you, this is actually a table. And he is going to do that with his first 100 days.
But I think that's an interesting picture, because he probably, at the time he says it, thinks it's a table. Or does he? Or is he know full well?
I mean, without putting him on the couch too much, I think that there are times when he certainly knows that's not the case, and then there are other times when I think he has convinced himself. I mean, one of the interesting things about Trump, just for those who want to read beyond what you're seeing day to day and look back at, and those of you who might not have covered and followed the coverage that closely during the campaign, there's been a lot of coverage of Trump's depositions over the years. He's been the subject of many lawsuits and he's filed many lawsuits. He's pretty careful about the truth in these depositions. So it really does make you wonder just how much of this is a slip. But you can see even, there's a transcript of an Associated Press interview he did this past week where he changed the number of missiles that were dropped in Syria, like a sentence later. So one sentence was 59 and then it was 79. And he's done that with me in a bunch of interviews where something goes from being, we've had the biggest number of, attendees ever, 20,000, and then a second later he'll say 30,000. That I think he knows he's just making it up as he goes along.
Okay, one last thing on this point before I turn to Alex for Mr. Outside. When you talk to him, does he ever say, I think I made a mistake in these, here's what I think I did wrong in the first 9-10 weeks? There is a sense in that piece you talked about in Politico where in his mind everything is a success. How is he with you? He
is not in the habit of acknowledging failures with reporters in general. With his staff privately, he will talk about certain things as mistakes, and one of his verbal tics is constantly asking people what they think of XYZ decision he made, or what do they think of XYZ staffer, and he asks staffers what they think of each other. And in those conversations, he will not just sow doubt or look for either an affirmation or a rejection of something he's either heard or is coming to believe, but he will sometimes acknowledge doubt. I do know that when healthcare failed, and he did not say this to me, on the phone with me, he was very, very bullish. But that night, when the initial bill, when he spoke to some friends, he said that he should have done tax reform first, and that is what he had preferred to do.
So, Alex, I saw this Washington Post ABC poll, run up to the 100 days, I assume, that says that 96% of Trump's voters say they would vote for him again. A significantly higher percentage than said they would vote for Hillary Clinton again among Clinton voters. Now, you've been out and about, out on the hustings, which if anybody wants to know, I'll define it at the end of the night. I'm the only reporter I think who actually looked this up. But anyway, you've been out. You've talked to Trump voters in many states. You've talked to Republican officials. What's your sense? Does that number strike you as right? Are you hearing that for Trump's people, they're sticking with him, or what have you found?
I was in the, I don't know how many folks followed the special election in Georgia last week, but I was in that district about 2 weeks ago, and really mainly interested in talking to Republicans because, if that district is going to flip, it's going to be because Republicans flip or stay home, right? And I didn't talk to anyone who voted for Trump who said, I regret it, I wish I had voted for Hillary Clinton. And I think we're probably never going to hear a lot of that from Republicans in general, even Republicans who are dissatisfied with the president. I also heard, a fair number of people expressing, various degrees of dissatisfaction with Trump. And I think because that election was so polarizing and because the Democratic candidate was someone who was so unacceptable to traditional Republicans as well as Trump's sort of distinctive constituency, I don't know that you're ever going to hear a lot of people saying, I regret voting for him.
But you have, I thought one of your pieces, which wasn't in Georgia, but hit 4 other states, did find, frustration a little bit?
Absolutely, and it's why I think it's I guess to be more direct in answering your question, I think it's a flawed polling question, right? Because I think voters in general are reluctant to admit error. I think, when you talk to the strategists for any incumbent president, they feel like one of the big political advantages they have going into re-election is that people don't like to admit they made a mistake. And if you won more votes than the other guy, that's a significant asset because people don't like to flip and admit they were wrong. Trump didn't win more votes than Hillary Clinton, although he did win the election. I did talk to quite a few Republicans in places like Georgia, Virginia, New Jersey, mainly your sort of suburban, educated, think like Jeb Bush type Republicans who wouldn't say they regretted voting for him, but would say, God, I wish he would stop it with Twitter. I wish he would listen to the adults. I didn't think it was going to be like this. And also a lot of anger at Congress. In some ways, I don't know whether it's a sort of coping mechanism or whether it's authentically people are frustrated with Congress rather than the president. But I probably spoke to half a dozen voters in Georgia in that district who said they're not thrilled about the president. They're more angry at Congress. You guys ran on repealing Obamacare, on doing all these other things, and where is that?
There's another question that both of you could address, which is, and it's one that's intrigued me, is within the Republican Party elected officials, within the members, the House members, Senate members, governors, there were 33 of the 50 of them that were Republican. I talked to one Democratic senator and said, what did the Republican colleagues tell you they think of Trump? The answer was pretty blunt. He said they think he's nuts. But he is the instrument for getting their policy. Now, I'm not asking you to second that particular judgment, but what's your sense of how the Republicans, we'll start in Washington, and then if you're comfortable there, or go, sure. What do they think of him?
I mean, I think that, I don't know that I would go with the diagnostic that you used, but I do hear variations on the theme of surprise. I think that Alex and I both had this experience, sorry for talking away from the mic, where people we spoke to throughout the campaign, we covered Trump together, were constantly convinced this was some kind of an act, some kind of mad genius, he's such a showman, oh my God, what's he gonna do next? And, I had lunch with a Republican senator 2 weeks ago who was still sort of astonished to find that his cell phone rings after he gets off a cable news set, and it's the President of the United States, saying that was great. Or, having read a quote that this senator had provided, you really defended me, that was wonderful. Or the tweets really disturb them and bother them. And I think that you are now seeing, Joni Ernst, I think, is obviously from Iowa, the junior senator, is the most glaring example of this. But you are starting to see Republicans in the House and in the Senate who have been concerned about what it would mean to criticize Trump for the reason you said. He is the vehicle for getting their policies accomplished. They are beginning to move away a bit. I don't think it's going to be moving away on policy dramatically, but they are starting to draw some lines about what is okay and what is not. In Ernst's case, it was about the trips to Mar-a-Lago. Mm-hmm. But what I hear about most frequently from members on the Hill is just the tweeting just drives them crazy, because he'll do something in the morning and their whole days are thrown having to respond to whatever it is that he did.
The broader side of this, or the policy side of this, is, I assume you've talked to, out and about Republicans, governors, people who work for them. So when we have these head-snapping changes, China's a currency manipulator. No, it's not. We're gonna destroy NAFTA. Well, maybe we're not. We're gonna do healthcare. No, we're gonna do taxes first. Actually, we're gonna do healthcare first. And I'm guessing, this is me, not you guys, that if you brought the president up here and said, what's in the health care bill you admire, you would get Ralph Cramden. That's me. I'm not asking. But my sense is, so how do the policymakers deal with a president who really uniquely, I think, among any president that I can think of, is so divorced from the mechanisms of policy?
So I think it's a couple things. In the big picture, I think I would have a different answer for you if you had asked me this 2 months ago, when I think there was a lot more concern that this guy is like driving an 18-wheeler and he is just like veering all over the road, and I, the governor of a mid-sized state in the Midwest, just need to hope he doesn't hit me. I think that at this point, when Trump unveiled his budget, or more correctly, when Mick Mulvaney unveiled his budget that the president sort of nominally endorsed, I spoke to a number of governors' offices that really felt like you're really jamming us here, including in red states, especially actually in red states where federal money, federal grants, economic development, that is as needed and in some ways more needed in a place like Alabama than it is here. And they were really concerned that if you start swinging the axe like that, it's my reelection on the line, right? I think now, after the failure of health care, after the myriad mixed signals on tax reform, I think there's a lot of skepticism that the president's actually going to do anything of scale through the legislative process. Doesn't mean he can't be disruptive, doesn't mean he won't get anything at all out of legislation, but I think of it a little bit like, if you remember it was either summer of 2011 or 2012, when Congress went right up to the edge on the debt ceiling, right? National default. Wall Street freaked out, and Congress eventually backed down. The next time there was a debt ceiling standoff, Wall Street didn't freak out, because the lesson they learned from the first standoff was, this is all posturing, Washington's full of nonsense anyway, they're not going to pull the trigger anyway. And I think that we're getting to that point with the administration.
But is that a sensible way to respond to this? That is, the confidence that we won't go over the cliff next week, given the dynamic of the House Freedom Caucus, Planned Parenthood, what Trump's own budget director said? I mean, this comes under I realize predictions are, dicey, but are we actually in the danger that now that people think it can't possibly happen, it could happen?
Sure, and to be clear, in terms of predictions, when we were both here a year ago,
I'm sorry.
When we were both here a year ago, I don't think either of us predicted that President Trump was likely to be who we were covering. So with that caveat, yes. It is still a very real possibility. And I think that if I talk to people in the White House and when I talk to people on the Hill, they are more afraid of it than they are letting on, but for the reason that Alex is talking about, which is that you cannot do a constant show of the sky is falling, right? I mean, that is much more disruptive in terms of markets and much more disruptive in terms of all kinds of things. But this White House has shown a frighteningly naive approach to dealing with Congress. And to be fair, there are some experienced legislative staffers. Mark Short, who was Mike Pence's chief of staff in a previous life, is their legislative affairs guy. And as I understand it, he has basically been either ignored or not listened to on any host of issues. But you had a situation during the first healthcare debacle where you had Stephen Bannon, who has never worked in government in his life, essentially threatening the members in a closed-door meeting with the legislative affairs guys from the White House standing outside the room, not even in the room. There needs to be an up or down vote tomorrow. And, no, there wasn't a vote, and that didn't augur particularly well for the White House. So I don't know what this is going to look like. My bet is always that there will not be a shutdown at this point, but I wouldn't bet my hands on it.
And if I could just, I think the notion that the White House will not accomplish anything of massive scale through the legislative process is totally consistent with a government shutdown, right?
Exactly.
Governors are calmer in some ways because they don't think their Medicaid money is going to be taken away because of the dysfunction and inertia in the federal system, right? That's also how you would end up with no government funding at all.
Correct.
And okay, if that were to happen, or if in fact we go not 100 days but 200 days with essentially nothing getting out of the Congress, how does Trump describe that as a historic success? What does he tell us?
Well, I think that becomes harder, Jeff. I think, look, I anticipate he will continue to cling to some whatever and point to it if we're at the 200-day mark. I mean, that's what I have to define it as. 100 days, you're going to see some version of what you've seen. Big Lee, we've done fabulous. If we get to August, which is the mark that I hear from people within the White House, because basically that recess, that if they don't have anything real that they can grab onto done, and candidly, keeping the government funded is not a massive accomplishment. It's
the sun rose in the east.
Sun rose in the east. they are concerned that if they don't get to that point, there are two things that I hear. One is that essentially there will be a wide-scale shakeup within the White House if we haven't started seeing a smaller one sooner, which we might. And that basically this presidency will be cooked because in 2018, it's going to be very hard to get deal-making done ahead of this particular midterm.
Try this on for size. That what you just described is what all of us who've looked at politics for 10 years, 20 years, a century, whatever, that's how we'd analyze it. I'm wondering whether the rules of the game have sufficiently changed that if nothing happens by this August, the impact on 2018 will not be nearly as big as conventional wisdom tells us, just because of the nature of how people vote, what they expect of government, how contemptuous they are of the whole process. I mean, assuming that their Social Security checks are coming, and that they're not starving to death.
Right, and the economy continues to basically hum along. Sure.
That maybe what we saw last November, in part, I don't mean to be the 50th blind guy on the elephant, was a feeling that, you know what, we'll elect this guy because the whole process is so,
Well, that is what.
it's corrupt, it's inefficient, has nothing to do with my life. Let's get somebody in there who's really going to, upend the table. And they might think the same thing about.
But if he doesn't do that, if nothing gets upended, and I'll let Alex answer this because I suspect he'll have a more coherent answer than I will, but just very briefly, what I have heard from people I have spoken to heading into this month is some frustration that there's, Republicans were elected to undo what they complained had existed before. If you have campaigned on repealing Obamacare for 3 cycles now, and you can't get it done when you have a governing majority, I think that's not that hard to spin. Even if your life is going on well, then you've just decided that sort of everything in Washington is corrupt and onward we go. I still think there will be some pain on that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that I would say 2 things. First is that midterm elections, as you know, are decided mainly by which set of voters wants to go out and send a message.
That's right.
Right? And if Republican voters feel dissatisfied and demoralized, as we saw in Georgia, as we saw in Kansas, huge drop-off in Republican participation, far more so than on the Democratic side, that's how you end up with a major swing, maybe not in control of Congress, but certainly in the balance of power in Congress. And I don't think that would be inconsistent with the phenomenon you're describing. I do think that if we're in August and the president feels like he has not gotten out of a Republican Congress what he wants, then you have a really, really interesting next year before the election where a president who was elected largely without the help of the party machinery, has no long-term sentimental attachment to the Republican, the institutions of the Republican Party, or even to most of the ideas of the Republican Party, maybe governs more like an independent. And you've had this sort of marriage of convenience between Donald Trump and Paul Ryan, who, if you put them in a polygraph, probably share like 3 values.
If that.
Right?
If.
But in the big picture, on all the big stuff, immigration, trade,
right.
The nature of the economy, national security, they are light years apart, probably in his heart of heart on cultural issues.
Stay with this a minute,
Yeah.
both of you, because one of the things that I've always argued when people say it's time for an independent third-party candidate, which Donald Trump actually was,
That's
it's
right.
just he seized control of a major party.
That's right.
That the dilemma for that was always going to be, who carries your water on Capitol Hill?
Right.
Yep.
So if he tries to govern as an independent, do we think that every odd day of the month he says something nice about Chuck Schumer?
Right.
It's a little hard for me to imagine that given the Democratic Party's feeling toward Trump, that he would be able to even reach across the aisle if he wanted to.
I think that's totally true. And I think that that's probably the biggest impediment, because if he had approached the presidency that way from the start, right, then I think he could already have a massive infrastructure bill that would have terrified the Democrats, that they would have probably had to vote for, and that Republicans could campaign on, despite being the party of fiscal austerity, right? But at the same time, I would never rule out any eventuality in terms of the president making, every politician has a price, right? And there are things that even someone like Nancy Pelosi, if the president put on the table, couldn't just walk away from.
Correct. And I actually, I'm I know that the public line is that he and Schumer are not speaking, but I am very skeptical of that. And I've been skeptical of that for some time. They've known each other a long time. And also, frankly, even on Pelosi, Trump really respects Nancy Pelosi, which, I mean, in 2011, when he was fake running that year, one of the items that I did for Politico at the time, actually might have been for our joint blog. No, was it for our joint? Anyway, it was in 2011. I can't remember if it was for our blog or something, a story on its own, but it was that he had sent Nancy Pelosi this note, one of his typical scrawled with a Sharpie on a news clip, and framed when she became speaker, "Nancy, you're the best." So, I mean, I think that there was this moment when I think that he could have gotten something done, and I believe that Alex is right, that I think that the Democrats, if it is in their interests, would move toward that.
I have to say, the thing that really amazed me about both his campaign and how he's been president is it would have taken relatively little for him to be in a much more powerful political position. He wouldn't have had to, get a different haircut or stop even tweeting. But it wouldn't have taken that much.
No, it would not.
But this is the part of him that I think still amazes me is the lack of any interest in thinking through, all right, how do I get something done that's going to...
You just said something that I think is the key to understanding why he's in this hole, which is not just that he has not done the outreach, which is not just sort of the lack of week to week or frankly even day to day strategery. It's the completely, and Alex may have thoughts on this too, but it's the completely reactive nature of this presidency. I mean, it is literally governing by watching cable news or governing by whatever has happened in somewhere else in the country, or governing by whichever foreign leader is coming to visit at that moment. But there's no, you had a pretty clear sense with previous presidents what they wanted to do in the first window of time, if not the first 100 days, the first however many weeks. Despite, I think, just having sort of a general sense of the impulses that he ran on, and there are issues that broadly, themes that he talked about for 30 years. We're getting ripped off. This country's ripping us off. Trade is terrible, et cetera. He doesn't really. He did not spend a whole lot of time during this campaign thinking about what he wanted to do with the office, and he is surrounded by just sort of these competing impulses of people who either want to get along with Paul Ryan or who want to undercut Paul Ryan completely, and it's dizzying to follow.
How do decisions get made in the White House?
How long do I have to answer that? It really depends. There is, one of the complaints about this White House that you hear over and over again is, among other things, he runs the operation the way he ran what is essentially a mom and pop real estate business in New York. The Oval Office door is always open. So just to give you a for instance. Glenn Thrush, one of our colleagues, who is also our colleague at Politico, and I had an Oval Office interview, and there were 6 aides, at least, sitting around us, which is sort of unheard of, to have that many people in it. The whole West Wing stopped. At one point, the vice president and the chief of staff, wandered in, which was also bizarre. There is no basic protocol. And this is the complaint that I hear from West Wing aides over and over and over again. It is incredibly easy for a decision to get made and then get undone by some other group of people.
Because they come in and see the president?
Because they come in and see the president, because someone puts a stop to something before it reaches the president's desk, because the president gets a phone call from someone outside the White House who says, do X, Y, Z.
One of the people that your article listed, one of the 20 people he talks to. Mm-hmm. Just one other thing. Staff infighting has been a kind of feature of White Houses, literally probably going back to George Washington.
Yes, literally. If you've seen Hamilton, yes, the answer is literally.
But the sense that some of these stories gin up is that, everybody you better not go into the White House mess without a food taster.
This is different.
Is it different?
Yeah, this isn't Team of Rivals. This is like Team of the Bloods and the Crips. This is really like if you think about it, the amount of time that these government-paid aides are spending on the phone with reporters or on the phone with friends of theirs outside the administration who they know will then tell reporters what's going on, to spin things their way or to undercut a rival faction, it's staggering. And it is not, the thing that I think is missing from this White House that is troubling, and I think that doesn't get really described this way that often, including by me enough, is that there is just a lack of a concept of the public trust and what it means. And they continue to run it as if it is this private family organization. Most striking detail to me in that Washington Post poll was, I think it was 61% of voters said that they disapprove of these jobs that Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump have. That's a big number.
Yeah.
If I could, I
Yeah.
think, I agree with everything Maggie said, obviously, but there's been so much sort of media self-flagellation over the last 5 months about things that were missed or we got wrong in the election. This is something that we got right, right? That the portraits of the way Trump operated as a candidate, as a manager, the world around him, the constant state of war, the American people knew on election day that this is the way he operates.
Yes.
Unless the media, in this case, did its job, and it never got to a substantial cohort of voters because they had turned off the normal receptors that would make people change their mind. There's a book about the 2012 campaign called The Gamble, Lynn Vavreck and John Sides, two very good political scientists, who describe the process of rise, scrutiny, decline for people like, I guess like Ben Carson, or I don't know. That the idea is, okay, somebody gets some visibility, the press focus on it, and if the weaknesses are revealed, they decline. I think in this case, you're absolutely right. On this and other areas, while the press has a lot to answer for, not in this area, and it didn't matter.
Well, I don't know that it didn't matter. It
Right.
didn't. It wasn't decisive,
That's right.
And
Okay.
that's just a distinction that I think is important to draw, because if Hillary Clinton had, won 70,000 additional votes in a few states, I don't think we would be sitting here saying that the Russian hacking didn't matter, right?
Fair
it
enough.
just didn't determine the outcome.
I understand that.
Yeah.
To pick up on what Maggie described in terms of the decision making, if you're a Republican governor, if you're a Republican House or Senate member up in 18, and you look at the possibility that without any legislative action, enormous changes can be done, just by executive action or inaction. Basically, you could destroy Obamacare even if you don't repeal it, if you don't provide the subsidies. And you can do a lot of things in the areas of, I think they just told California, that high-speed rail project of yours, forget about it. So it goes back to what I asked you originally about Republican feelings about Trump. But do you think that these Republican governors who have to make things work in their states are going to put pressure on the White House not to behave like this, to deliver us the kind of government, whether conservative or liberal, we need to make the exchanges work,
Yeah.
to make job training work? Do you sense that
That's happening. They're largely they don't want to draw attention to it because, as frustrated as they are with the president, they do fear him, and they fear him less as a governing force and more as a political force, right? And as a force for driving the news cycle. Right. So I wrote this story a few weeks ago about governors who were sort of behind the scenes fighting the White House budget document, and I naively thought that governors who were bitterly opposed to cuts that would harm their states immediately and profoundly would want to be publicly associated with that position. And I, in dealing with the governor of Kentucky, introduced Donald Trump on a Monday. 3 days earlier, he had been on a conference call with the White House budget director saying, "You cannot do this to my state." And I thought that that would be a position that a governor would want to be attached to. The hostility and just frankly the interpersonal rudeness of his staff in refusing to answer questions about the governor standing up for the interests of his state was shocking to me.
And what does it tell you guys?
Well, I mean, it tells me in that particular case, one or two governors were happy to be on the record, but by and large, they don't think the president is remaking the Republican Party from top to bottom. They do think that he has the ability to drop a sledgehammer
Correct.
on any individual at any given time, and they just don't want to be that guy.
And he knows it. It's unpleasant, frankly, as people non-legislatively and non-governing who he's dropped sledgehammers on. It's unpleasant. I had a conversation. This is not domestic. This is international. But I had a conversation with somebody who had been in Israel, and this has not gotten a ton of coverage either so far. But I think that I imagine it will as it becomes clear to people that Trump did not actually move the embassy in Israel as he said he would, amazingly, it didn't happen.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of talk about sort of the shift in the relationship, what had existed between Netanyahu and Obama, and now what is perceived to exist between Trump and Netanyahu. In reality, Netanyahu is aware as anybody else that Trump is unpredictable, shall we say, and prone to attack somebody who he claims is an ally pretty quickly, is more than willing to go off about affairs and elections in another country, as we've seen on Twitter, with his not so subtle pushing of Marine Le Pen in France. And that is really hard for people to deal with.
This unpleasantness, if one goes up against Trump, have you experienced this?
Yes.
I think it's important, if to the extent that you feel like talking about it, what happens? I mean, is it that your Twitter feed gets bombed? Is it that people make threatening phone calls?
Yeah, I mean, some of this comes with the territory, right? So it's I do think that there is a tendency, especially because I think a lot of the reporters who cover Trump and covered him during the campaign had never done a campaign before, but especially for reporters who have worked in New York City and say covered Rudy Giuliani, he was not exactly gentle with reporters. Even Mike Bloomberg, attacked a reporter once by telling him he was a disgrace at a press conference. So and Bill de Blasio is not exactly easygoing with the New York Post. So there is a long tradition from the political milieu that Trump really does come from, which is this sort of some kind of a combination of Ed Koch and Rudy Giuliani, of that tradition. And I think that feels normal to him to do. What he's doing, though, is he's doing it on Twitter. He's doing it with his 20 million or however many he has now followers. And yeah, it's like he sets off this swarm. Alex and I did a story in February of 2016 about what it's like to be cyberbullied by Trump. And we talked to a bunch of people who had, they would go to an event or they would go to a doctor's appointment and they'd put their phone down and they'd come out and it was like he had tweeted about them. And Trump moves on pretty quickly to some other target. Often anyway, but his horde, remains and just continues to go at whoever it is. It's disquieting.
The last time I was on the stage, I was there with Hugh Hewitt, very prominent, I think very smart, very conservative guy. And I raised the question with him. He had basically backed Trump because of the Supreme Court. And one of his Never Trump colleagues, Brett Stevens, who's I guess now at your paper, said, "That's fine, Hugh, but this man is an existential threat." And the question I wonder is whether or not that perception may wind up spreading among people who right now are seeing Trump instrumentally, the carrier of their policies. I mean, do you have any sense, Alex, that there's that small disquieting thing in the back of the minds of some Republicans?
The notion that he's a threat on a scale that can't be tolerated, you mean?
Yeah.
Look, I think that a lot of Republicans and I don't know whether Hugh is in this category, but a lot of Republicans who backed Trump and cited explanations like the Supreme Court did that for tactical, personal reasons, that they felt that it was important that they back their party's nominee, and they never thought he would win, right? So
I don't think that was Hewitt's case.
Yeah, sure.
His endorsement was very painful to him.
Having said that, I think that the reason why the cabinet nominations have been so contentious, the reason why, we still don't have a sub-cabinet, or virtually anyone staffed in government, but the reason why those sort of the great offices of state were so contentious is because Republican senators, as well as obviously Democratic senators, they're uncomfortable with the idea of Donald Trump having control of nuclear weapons, right? And it's not that they are at the point of saying, some of them in private would describe him as a threat to life on the planet, but most of them would say something more, much more reserved, that, they are concerned if he had come in and named Newt Gingrich Secretary of Defense and Mike Flynn Secretary of State, there are a lot of Republican senators who would be looking at the situation in North Korea and thinking, oh my God, right? Are we about to, do something drastic? The fact that Jim Mattis is in that job, and to a lesser extent Rex Tillerson, the fact that General McMaster is the National Security Advisor, I think has people feeling a lot calmer.
You've anticipated my next question, because what I was getting to was that apart from the court, on this existential threat, Hewitt said the grown-ups will take care of that. And he specifically meant Secretary of State Tillerson, Mattis in defense, McMaster at national security, I can't remember who else.
Kelly.
But the question is, I understand that argument. But Donald Trump is, among other things, commander-in-chief. Mm-hmm. So if Donald Trump called in this team and said, look, I want those missile sites in North Korea taken out.
You're asking me a very difficult question, predictively.
Good job, lady.
So, hey, that is true. You are a journalist. I just want to be. I want to be thoughtful about answering it. I think that, look, we have one of the difficulties in covering Trump and in assessing Trump for questions like what you asked about existential threat is that he's so contradictory in his behaviors, and he's so contradictory, and he is the classic sort of what he said, what he meant, right? So, a lot of what we have seen from him so far, frankly, with the exception of the executive order on banning travel from seven Muslim-majority nations at the beginning of his administration, a lot of what we've seen is pretty standard Republican decision-making and certain language on regulatory reform. On this, I think that he is so far so overwhelmed by the knowledge of what he doesn't know. So what I would say as a counterfactual to your concern that he will go and he will make some sweeping decision or sweeping statement like that is, in his first Oval Office meeting with President Obama, actually I guess it was the only one they had, it was supposed to be a brief meeting during the transition. It was 90 minutes. And from the people close to Trump, I heard that the president-elect sounded overwhelmed and their words, not mine, terrified by the scope of what he heard. And President Obama emerged terrified at how little President-elect Trump seemed to know. And so far, what we have seen, I think, is a willingness on the part of President Trump to defer to people who do know better, again, generally speaking. And I would not underestimate the degree to which the failure that was the executive order on the travel ban and the controversy around appointing Steve Bannon to the NSC and the downgrading of 2 other permanent seats, that really hurt Steve Bannon's ability to negotiate and do what he inartfully and incorrectly described as the deconstruction of the administrative state, which didn't make any sense, but was the wrong word. And so I think that he is willing to actually listen to the grown-ups much more than you would think. The problem is, it's not going to happen anytime soon. The problem is what happens in the beginning of year 3, if assuming that we're on the path that we're on now. and he feels like he has been there for 2 years, and he tires of reading the grown-ups are in charge, the grown-ups are running things. The thing that is the riskiest with Trump is that he has some kind of knee-jerk reflexive response to what he deems as someone suggesting he's being puppeteered. The President Bannon covers of Time magazine and headlines and calling Bannon the great manipulator, that was very damaging for Bannon, and so he does worry about that kind of thing.
I want to turn to the Democrats and where they are at. We saw in, I guess it was a mayor's race in Nebraska, a kind of miniature of the debate, and that is there was a otherwise liberal, economically left candidate who was pro-life. And for some people in the Democratic Party, that was the 13th stroke of the clock. We cannot back, which cast out about all the others. We cannot back anyone. It is the core message of this party, or a core message, to be pro-choice. Then you had Bernie Sanders, the hero of the Democratic left, saying, no. The issue is economic fairness. We have to have a big tent. And I saw this in Philadelphia when I went down to do a piece about a couple of young Democrats who are trying to create a big tent and are facing some opposition from people who say, we do not want, if you are not pro-choice, if you are not on transgendered rights, basically what's called fairly not identity politics. How much do you think this is going to affect the Democrats as they try to concoct a message next year to try to take back the House, if not the Senate?
I think it'll matter enormously. I think a couple things. First, I think the candidate in Omaha was so controversial, not just because he was opposed to abortion, but because he had sponsored legislation, ultrasound legislation, right? Which, Democrats, I think, even quite liberal Democrats, will tolerate people like, someone like Tim Kaine has a pretty mixed record on abortion. Bob Casey.
Right. Yeah.
The ultrasound thing is very far outside where sort of the Democratic mainstream is. It's not really an issue that the mayor of Omaha has control over, but it's far outside the normal range for Democrats. I also think part of what's going on there, and this may be the bigger, the identity versus economy sort of debate that Bernie Sanders likes to have. I think in some ways the bigger debate is the debate about Bernie Sanders personally, right? That I think part of the reason why that issue in Omaha blew up so much is because either the very same day or the day before, Sanders declined to say whether John Ossoff, the Democratic candidate in Georgia, whether he considered him a progressive, right? He sort of gave this brush-off answer that I don't know if he is, right? Which is a damaging thing to be said about a candidate in a special election.
It should be pointed out that Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat.
Sure.
Adds to the kind of thing.
But I think the combination of him sort of poo-pooing this high-profile Democratic House candidate and then saying separately, I'm not concerned about this guy's deviations from liberal orthodoxy, that just, it is like designed in a lab to drive folks in the party absolutely crazy, right? That the frustration with him as a force is really still very intense, and it's going to be intense throughout the primaries next year.
Yes. No, I agree with that. I think that, look, as I was listening to Alex talk, I agree with everything he said. I also think that if you looked at and polling, as we know at this point, is absolutely meaningless in terms of 2020.
Right.
But allow me to dive in anyway.
Well, it says that.
Right. But I think that it will not just be through the midterm cycles that I think the Democratic Party is going to be contending with sort of the pro or con Bernie question. I think the Democrats, if Bernie Sanders decides to run again for president, are going to be contending with it well into early 2020 and possibly longer.
And I was just talking to one of our other colleagues about this the other day, that if you see what the Democrats, sort of the institutional Democratic Party is doing right now with Sanders, let's bring him inside the tent rather than have him throwing bombs from outside. Let's let him do a bunch of events that, will make him happy and will also serve our interests. He can raise money for us, but, he's not going to be president of the United States. This is what Republicans were doing about Donald Trump 4 years ago.
Exactly.
Before I turn to the questions, there's this. one other area, which is the notion of Donald Trump as a populist. In his in his acceptance speech, in that 2-minute commercial he put on at the end, and in the inaugural, half of those words could have been spoken by Bernie Sanders.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you've been ripped off, the elite are depriving you of the life you should have. Some people did note that all of the villains in the 2-minute ad happened to be Jewish. I don't know that that's fair.
The 2-minute ad also used the word globalist or something. I mean, I think it went a little further.
Well, it's, international banking.
It was correct.
But the question is this, to the extent, and maybe even in asking the question I'm answering, to the extent that Trump understands the message that he was speaking, I said there may be, it is striking to me that every single policy decision, other than like immigration and trade, which are, are let's cut taxes hugely for the rich. Let's slash the essential benefits of Medicare. Let's knock off the $500 grant we give to help people get a mortgage. There is nothing that he has, that his White House has proposed that I can see has any benefit to the less well off.
Right. And what you just said, I think, is why, depending on how things go, he could have a very tough time in a re-election in 2020, and why I think it is very, very hard, if you are him, to really try to govern as an independent president, although I do think he will at some point try, and then I think stop trying. Look, like, I don't think it's fair to say that he doesn't understand it. I think that there is an oversimplification of this idea that he is not a smart man. He is certainly not intellectually curious, and he doesn't read books. So those are my qualifications for somebody being or among them, but they are certainly not the only ones. And he was smart enough to get himself elected, right?
No question
I don't
about
think
that.
I think at a certain point you have to realize that. I do think, and it was not just Russia, and it was not just and so forth and so on.
No, my point is, he clearly tapped into this feeling,
right?
But I don't see anything he now has to feed it.
I think that that's why I say I think that we're coming upon, and this is why getting some kind of a legislative victory done soon is so incredibly important to them, and it's really, frankly, why he should have done infrastructure first, and come out and made the Democrats an offer that I suspect they couldn't refuse, to Alex's point earlier. I think this is a huge problem for him. I mean, I think that if you do see someone like Sanders run again, or somebody, using the Sanders message. Remember, it's not just that they were using the same language. Bernie Sanders and Trump sound alike in some ways. I mean, they both have sort of the outer borough accent. They both to a point say billionaires. I mean, like, there is a degree to which there is an outer borough working class voice that Trump speaks in and that Trump sees himself as. I don't think selling yourself that way with the policies undergirding it being not sustaining that is going to be doable for 2020. And I think he has gotten himself into a tough position. He also has, I think it's the wealthiest West Wing we've ever seen. He's got the wealthiest cabinet we've ever seen. Those are pretty hard facts to run away from too. And so if you have somebody, either Sanders or somebody who can harness what Sanders did very effectively, especially with labor, I think that's very problematic for Trump.
Do you think, Alex, that the conflicts of interest issue, it may sound trivial, but the expense required to protect Melania in New York and Donald in Mar-a-Lago, that has the potential to also maybe hurt him politically?
Absolutely. And I think, one of the big debates among Democrats is whether they should be focusing more on sort of the pot of issues around ethics, or the pot of issues around, that you just described around, you campaigned on X, you're actually doing Y. And in some ways it's a false choice. You can do both, but it is a matter of emphasis. I think the cost of Mar-a-Lago is probably the most sort of politically embarrassing thing, more embarrassing than, while it may seem extravagant for the president and the first lady to have protective details in different cities, I think a lot of voters, whatever, you have to protect the life of the first lady.
That's right.
you don't have to go golfing in Florida every weekend, right? And that kind of thing is a real irritant definitely for Democrats, but then also for that, Maggie mentioned Joni Ernst, the group of Republicans who sort of talked themselves into supporting him, but don't love the guy.
That's right.
One more before I turn to these. What, from your perspective, what is if I said, okay, not if, I'm going to say it, what, not counting Gorsuch, would you point to as the most impressive achievement of this administration now that we are at 93 days and counting?
You took away what I would reach for. I mean, honestly, Gorsuch really is it, and it is not nothing. But this has been a pretty protein-free administration so far.
I do. In fairness to the president,
yes.
When you think about the sort of nightmare scenarios that people were laying out on November 7th, I think that if we were sitting here almost 6 months later and China had invaded Taiwan and Russia had invaded Ukraine and Poland and Germany, I think that back then there were a lot of people who thought that was not an unrealistic scenario, right? That every bad guy in the world would treat this as open season, right? And the fact that he does have a national security team in place, I don't know how much it's a credit to him personally, but the team that he has put in place has created at least the impression of stability in a way that I think would have surprised all of us, 6 months ago.
I agree with that.
Okay. A history question. Has the first 100 days historically been enough time for presidents to achieve significant change, or are we judging this administration too harshly? I'm going to weigh in on this too. But
why don't you start, and then we can weigh in.
It's an inane metric, and it started because after Franklin Roosevelt had done everything he did out of necessity, because the country was in a state of collapse. 15 big bills, agriculture, farmers saved from bankruptcy, the banking system, civilian conservation corps, newsreels seeing, young men planting trees and stuff. People look back and said, wow, that was some 100 days. And look, Kennedy was so annoyed by this that in his inaugural, there's a line, all this will not be finished in the first 100 days, first 1,000 days, because he said, this is ridiculous. So I do think it is I think the other thing is between events and the unexpected, the idea that you can chart a president's course after the first 100 days.
I completely agree with you. I think that what I would say, though, in this case, and I really do agree, and I think especially for a president who is new to governing, a lot of people would be willing to give him some slack on this. The problem is that this particular president can never admit any form of weakness or defeat, number one, and number two, is doing the thing that he often does where he says, this is such a ridiculous thing. He said it in an interview last week. Meanwhile, they're scrambling to do, everything they can to underscore a fabulous 100 days at some point in the next 2 weeks. And you can't really have it be both and expect people are going to take it that way. So, and frankly, he put out this, 100-day plan. I don't remember their guidepost for this. That he tried to disavow with the AP as someone came up with that. Taking ownership of this stuff is the buck does not always stop with him. And so I do think it's unfair, but I think he has bought into it to such an extensive degree that it is also hard to toss it out.
I get the sense sometimes that the desperation to pass something is such that if somebody got a bill before Donald Trump and said, we figured out how to repeal Obamacare, Medicare for all. Yeah?
I'm so glad you said this, because this has been like my personal obsession for since the beginning of this campaign. That and when you ask Republicans point blank, what do you think would happen if Democrats took Congress and sent him a single payer bill? They take a really long pause, right? Because he likes winning, and he doesn't have any particular fixed ideological values. So in the event that, I don't think single payer would ever get to his desk, but if a $1 trillion infrastructure bill that totally busted the federal budget and that made Paul Ryan want to go put his head under the covers and cry, were to somehow get to him, he'd sign it in a second.
Also, frankly, no, single payer, I agree with you, but it's not really that far off. You're talking about a guy who ran on not cutting entitlements. So, there is. No, I understand. I'm agreeing with you. There is. there is something to that. I think we are a little far down the path now for that to happen, but it is, again, something that could have happened earlier.
And that's, that's the part where it would not have taken that much
Nope.
for Trump to say, you know what?
Not at all.
He publicly said both parties have failed. He publicly broke with virtually every part of the Republican canon.
Well, one of the things that's strange about him, though, is that actually for somebody who appears to be quite risk-taking and devil-may-care, he's actually fairly cautious. Yeah.
Well, that's good to hear when you think about foreign policy. No, I'm serious. I mean, caution is, a highly underrated.
To Alex's point.
It really is. I mean, this was something that I have a few Democratic friends and family members, some of them in the audience, and after the election, like one of the things that I sort of told them as a measure of reassurance, right, is that this idea that he's just going to be like firing nuclear weapons in the air like Yosemite Sam, that's not actually how he behaved during the campaign. It took him forever to make difficult decisions, including on personnel, on running television ads, on spending money. He's actually not that impulsive, except on like daily news cycle stuff.
Right. He's impulsive on things that are like utterly self-defeating and stupid, like tweeting criticism of somebody whose help he might need and who will now be inclined to totally be against him forever. That kind of thing he has a problem with. But other issues, not so much.
This question reminds us that we are at the 92nd Street Y. Can you envision impeachment? No. How about that? How about no?
No, not right now.
Can you envision impeachment and conviction? No. Can you envision impeachment with a Republican House? No. If Democrats take the House in 2018, which is a big if, I think there will be enormous pressure from the Democratic base to impeach the guy, and I don't know what happens. They would need like a cause, but you wouldn't need much. You already have Maxine Waters out there talking, but Maxine Waters is not like a fringe member of the party, right? This is the equivalent of, not of like Dan Burton, but like maybe Jim Sensenbrenner or something under Obama talking about it, and that would have been something we would have taken pretty seriously.
Okay. I mean, to me, it's just one of those, at present, this is perhaps not the best use of time if you want to.
To be clear, I'm not saying it would be a good idea for them to do that, but.
Yeah, I mean, Democrats for Pence is an odd, movement. Speaking of which, one of the questions is, what's the view of Vice President Pence from inside the political process?
Inside the political process or inside the White House? Or inside the political class, the reporting class? Inside the White House, there are mixed views. He has become somebody over time who is often the last person the president runs something by. And so in that case, that's a big deal for somebody who poll tests, the person who's selling him something at a grocery store, essentially. I mean, that's not a bad thing to be the last voice. He is not perceived as a threat. You mentioned food taster earlier, right? This is not somebody who inspires that need in Trump, which is something one of Trump's friends actually said to me on the record at one point about Mike Pence. There is a general view that he is a force for good. I mean, I'm not saying on policy. I'm just saying that he does not, if our reductionist prism is that people playing to Trump's worst instincts is a problem, Pence does not do that. And Pence, while he is known as a social conservative and as a fiscal conservative, he is also willing to do some bending when need be. There is also a feeling just more broadly, and this is inside the White House and outside the White House, that he's playing a long game. That he took a very high risk, high reward gamble joining this ticket. That it was probably his only real shot at national office. He had thought about running before, never did. Had a very difficult time in his own state in 2015 for a variety of reasons, and that he is basically hanging out. He is also somebody who is close to or has a decent relationship with Paul Ryan. And that is not always seen as a positive in the West Wing.
In the White House.
Yeah, there are an enormous, not enormous, there are a number of people around the president who are deeply mistrustful of Paul Ryan. Not just because of the campaign, but that certainly was part of it. And the debacle of the health care bill involved sort of a vote count that was not quite there.
Now, this is a quote from you, but I'm going to ask Alex to answer it first because it's a jump ball. You wrote, on Twitter earlier today that I've been pretty direct on the media's failures
Oh, boy.
in the 2016 election. What do you, and you could both weigh in, what do you believe they were? How do we fix them? And secondly, do Clinton aides really deny any blame for their loss? Do you want, if you want to take the second one first, maybe that's a more
Yeah, I
interesting
mean,
one.
I'll try to be like rapid fire about this. The Clinton aides in private do not deny that they made big mistakes, but in public they have pulled off this, I think, pretty amazing feat of losing an election while acknowledging no mistakes of their own or no faults on the part of their candidate, right? And as a public relations matter, that's actually pretty impressive.
That's right.
In private, they are much more reflective.
Correct.
In terms of the media's failures, I don't want to speak to the press in general because I don't like doing that. I would say in terms of like what do I think I got wrong about the election, and I hope this doesn't sound glib. I never envisioned a scenario where there could be a gulf between the popular vote and the Electoral College this way. I think that when I look back, and I have done this, look back on the articles I wrote during the campaign, the notion that Donald Trump could never break out of the low to mid 40% range was foundational to the way I understood the election. And in a two-candidate race, that's supposed to be determinative, right? And it wasn't. So that's a failure of imagination on my part. I do think, broadly speaking, we put too much trust in the operational sophistication of the Clinton campaign and the Democratic Party. I think that there's always a risk in political journalism, all kinds of journalism, that you interpret the present through the lens of the immediate past. And the Obama campaign was so successful in its use of data, in its use of field, that in a lot of ways I think we lost sight of, we paid too much attention to their operational sophistication and not enough attention to what were at the time pretty glaring flaws in terms of message and in terms of messenger.
Yeah, I agree with everything Alex said, and I don't like speaking for the media broadly, but for somewhat broadly and for myself, certainly on this, I was the Trump reporter from the very beginning when we basically started covering Trump full time, and then I was one of the Trump reporters, and so my job was to cover essentially what the campaign was doing and what he said and what he was doing every day, and he was doing 1,000 different things at once, and you just got flooded with it. Where I think that we all could have done better, and I don't know how this would have looked, but there shouldn't, in addition to everything Alex said, I think that there should not have been this moment on, whatever it was, November 16th, where it was like, how's Donald Trump going to deal with his business conflicts? I mean, this is a pretty massive issue that is chewing him up day by day still, because you still have questions about violations of the Emoluments Clause. You're going to have lawsuits filed. I don't think there was enough focus on that at all. I know that the big question when Clinton supporters say that, and I was responding to somebody having forgotten I was going to be here tonight and might get asked about that, when I tweeted that this morning, and lesson learned, but when Clinton supporters say it, the response that I believe they are looking for is, I feel a little like I'm in an alley with somebody holding a broken glass at my neck saying, apologize for email coverage. And, look, do I think that people focused on the email story extensively? Sure. The email story also began in 2015, before the campaign, before Trump was even in the race. And Trump was treated for much of 2016, including by the Clinton team, which told us openly that they would love to run against Donald Trump. We heard this over and over again. He was treated like a joke. And so I don't know what to compare this to. There was an open FBI investigation into the party's nominee. That's a big deal.
Well, in fact, in that 4 million word piece today about James Comey,
It's a good story.
which I think will be a Netflix 10-part series over several seasons. The piece actually does make it clear that what Clinton did raised very
Yes.
legitimate. At least that's the New York Times. So, process question, Maggie. How do you decide who's the lead writer when you write with Glenn?
I am
You
so
get
sick of that question.
All right,
I'm
then don't
sorry.
answer it.
No, I'll answer.
Don't answer it.
I'll answer
This
it.
is no. This is the equivalent of asking a songwriter. You write the words first or the music first.
That's
They
right.
hate that question.
Usually when Glenn and I do a story together, recently he has done the first draft, and then I will take a spin through it later, and we do essentially equal fact accumulation, and then I will go and do fact checking. So that accounts for the first byline question. I did the first byline today on the 20 people outside of the Trump West Wing who he consults with, because I did the vast majority of the piece.
Does it really matter who's the first?
No, which is why I said
It's interesting, though. I mean, there are these things that, as a reporter, you never think people read into your stories.
Exactly.
Or that you assume they read into your stories. And the paper recently announced that they're changing the way we do bylines, right? So, rather than the story I wrote from Georgia, rather than saying by Alexander Burns and then, Dateline Alpharetta, Georgia, it would say by Alexander Burns in Alpharetta, Georgia, right? Because people, it turns out, probably not in this crowd, but a lot of people don't understand that all caps city name means that the story's from there. That market research shows people think that it means, oh, so this is about Yemen, right? Not that you're actually, oh, you're in Yemen, right? So that's amazing. So they're changing things like that for just sort of like media literacy reasons. I don't, we'll never change that in terms of the byline.
The only reason I ask is that, Gilbert and Sullivan, Sullivan and Gilbert, Abbott and Costello, Costello and Al, at this.
When I started at the paper, I saw, it was a sort of a family function about a year after I started, and people were asking me like, oh, so are they like letting you write more on your own? Like, were you writing with someone else because that was like a training wheels thing? Like, did they not really trust you? And like, no, that's not what it is at all. Like, reporters team up all the time, and it's a hugely helpful thing to just be open to having two bylines, because otherwise reporters would just be knife fighting constantly for the one byline.
And you don't get the fullest report. When Alex and I did co-byline stuff in 2016, and really when we were at Politico too, we often just traded off. In the case of Glenn and me too, it isn't just the sort of the first draft cut thing. It's also that we get the Washington Dateline when he does it. And so if it's my byline first, it's a New York Dateline, which is not, because just a qualifier here, well, I'm a White House correspondent, but I basically commute. Glenn is there full time, so.
Speaking of Glenn, you haven't shown up on Saturday Night Live, and he shows up all the time.
He does, I know. He's
happy about
a star.
this?
I'm okay with it. It'll be all right.
I think you mentioned it's because he's at the briefings and you're not.
And whatever, that's good.
All right,
Yeah.
okay. All right. When will Bannon be gone?
I'm sorry.
Tonight, it's this crowd. If gone from the inner circle, who will be there this is actually, if he is banished, who represents his beliefs?
So it's a great question. Do you mind if I answer this? It's a great question. In this fight that's been going on, that based on the question I assume you're all familiar with, between Steve Bannon and Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, who is also there, there's been a real effort to try to consolidate everyone around Kushner and like isolate Bannon, and to make clear that Bannon doesn't have this army of allies inside the West Wing. So Stephen Miller, who worked for Jeff Sessions in the Senate, someone just hissed, or did I imagine that?
I think they were saying Steven.
He is very, very, very anti-immigration, and he has been for a very long time, and was the earliest on the Trump campaign, was there long before Steve Bannon was. There's been an effort to say, well, Stephen Miller was hired by Jared Kushner, and he's over there with him, and Bannon's really on his own, and Stephen Miller is the keeper of this nationalist conservative flame. So I don't think there's going to be an issue in terms of who keeps the policies that the base that elected Trump care about. I think the bigger question is, do you want, and I think candidly this is the question the president is dealing with, as I understand it from my reporting, is do you want Steve Bannon roaming the quiet countryside, armed with, outside of the White House, armed with whatever he knows?
Okay. Our revels are almost ended, but I'm going to ask you guys, you people, you carbon-based life forms, I don't want any offense here. The question I always ask everybody at the end. So if you are summoned back to this stage, let's say in 2 years, let's say we give you a break next year. maybe in 2 or 3 years. Are you optimistic about what the next couple of years will bring, or are you pessimistic about what the next couple of years will bring?
Well, first of all, thank you for having us back, and thank you all for coming, because this is a real pleasure for both of us and an honor. If you do have us back, which would be great.
Even next year is okay.
Go ahead. Yes.
I think I'm an optimist just as a general matter, and I do think that one of the things that we're looking at in terms of Washington is that the system is so profoundly dysfunctional and broken that there's almost nowhere to go but up, right? And I don't quite know how that happens, and I don't think that's just a matter of party, right? That it's been a long time since people have felt good about their government. So, if the sort of just laws of physics apply, at some point things have to bounce back up, and if they don't, we'll be having a really interesting discussion at that point.
Thank you for having us, because this really has been fabulous, and thank you all
a
for
pleasure.
coming tonight. I'm not an optimist by nature, as some relatives in the audience and Alex could tell you, but I agree, generally speaking, that there's really nowhere else for this to go but one place, or stay the same, at which case then you're going to have voters reacting to like massive dysfunction. But I think that it's really important to remember that, as Alex said, just this sort of, we're going to be living in the comparison that I like to use, and I haven't been able to get it into print yet, but the description we keep hearing about this administration is, this is Orwellian, this is just like 1984. Like, no, it's actually much more like Animal Farm, right? I mean, like, he campaigned on tearing, creating a whole new system, and he's essentially all of the actions that you pointed to that benefit the wealthy. The fact that one of his main campaign promises was that he was going to undo President Obama's executive order on Dreamers. He's left a lot of the system in place, and that's going to be a challenge for him.
Well, John McCain's famous quote, right?
Oh my God.
It's
yes.
always darkest just before things get completely black.
On that happy note.
However, because I don't want to send this audience home, like the end of an Ingmar Bergman film, I will quote you something that Elie Wiesel said to me in an interview. I asked him once, I may even have been on here, are you an optimist or a pessimist? And he's thinking of his life. He said, I'm an optimist because I have to be. And I think that's probably the best way to summarize where I am on this. I think there's a lot of stuff out there that is cause for alarm. On the other hand, 200 and something years ago, those dead white guys actually did create a pretty solid system that has so far been pretty resilient in the face of a lot of challenges. So I'll put my faith in those guys. And with that, thank you for joining us.